Paradox, the Kabbalistic Path of Expanding Consciousness. Part 6, Tools for Managing Paradoxes, introducing PoleHolders. We have defined paradox as a truth that is too deep for the logical mind to grasp in its fullness, and so instead the truth splits into two mutually exclusive half-truths that contradict each other and yet, irrationally, are both true. When the mind encounters a paradox, it freezes like a deer in headlights, not knowing whether to run here or there, backwards or forwards, to this truth or that which contradicts it. This uncertainty produces anxiety, and the mind scrambles for solid ground. But there are also tools for meeting paradox on its terms, facing its contradictions, and even harnessing them for good. An effective tool must mirror the stubborn complexity of the paradox itself. With that as our criteria, we introduce the concept of PoleHolders. You are probably familiar with the science experiment performed with a magnet and iron filings. When you sprinkle the filings near the magnet, they automatically arrange themselves into a pattern of lines. The two poles of the magnet carry opposite charges called north and south. The interaction of these two opposite poles creates an invisible force field that is always present, surrounding the magnet. Though the force field is always there, the iron filings make it visible. When they are poured onto a paper that lies on top of a magnet, instead of staying in a clump, as one would expect, they are pulled into this pattern of lines by the magnet's radiating force field. As below in the physical plane, so above in the emotional, mental, and spiritual planes. We live in a tangle of intersecting force fields. Every value, belief, and opinion creates a field that draws some folks and repels others. Let's examine one such psychic force field that is perhaps the greatest challenge facing the Jewish world today: how to reconcile the paradoxical values of truth and faith, emet ve'emunah. First, let's define our terms, which we will do in the most extreme form, and you will understand why shortly. We'll define the truth pole as the pursuit of knowledge through science and logic, disparaging all that cannot be proved, like tradition, mystery, and faith. And we'll define the faith pole as the current expression of Judaism in the ultra-Orthodox world, the accumulation of teachings, practices, customs, halachic rulings, and social norms observable today. Now, each one of these polarized positions has a mission, an action plan, an upside, and a downside. So let's go through them one by one, beginning with the truth polarity. Mission statement: fierce and uncompromising pursuit of truth, defined by what is either A, observable to the senses, or B, provable through logic. Let science conquer superstition. It's an action plan. Question authority. Don't accept anything on faith. Verify all assertions. Smash the idols of tradition. Its upside is its capacity for honesty, which is only as reliable as one's freedom and willingness to distinguish between what is really so versus what is supposed to be so according to doctrine. For if you are bound by doctrine, then any evidence that contradicts that doctrine must be dismissed, even when it's true, like the discovery that the earth revolves around the sun, which contradicted the church's doctrine, and so the evidence was suppressed. There was no space for honest exploration of what really is. But the downside is a kind of arrogance, where anything that I cannot verify, which could be a truth that is just bigger, deeper, or smarter than me, is brazenly dismissed as superstition. In rejecting the wisdom of tradition, mistakes get made which often cannot be undone, even though one is sorry later. For example, the arrogance of science that anyone who questioned the use of DDT and other miracle pesticides was a reactionary dinosaur. Look how big and beautiful and green the vegetables are, and how much more profitable the crop. And then, 10, 20 years later, you learn that the DDT was actually poisoning the public, as the cancer rates began to soar. And yet, people's lives were already lost. You can't take that back. Now, let's move to the faith polarity, whose mission statement is, wage a holy war to keep the Torah alive and unadulterated in the Jewish people until Mashiach comes. There is no truth that needs to be considered except Torah. Action plan. Create a well-trained and disciplined army that follows commands and doesn't ask questions. Every army in the world expects that of its soldiers. Upside. Extremely successful from the perspective of demographics. All other denominations are dwindling from attrition and intermarriage, while the ultra-Orthodox community continues to thrive, at least in terms of numbers. And secondly, the reliance on faith and tradition enables access to transcendent truths. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in the spiritual sense of the word. We are standing on the shoulders of the giants of the generations before us. Its downside, however, is that it creates a habit of disassociation between one's inner sense of truth and what one accepts and preaches as doctrine, such that eventually one loses touch with one's self-authenticity altogether. For if a person finds themselves disagreeing with the commander-in-chief, so to speak, they must repress that disagreement and invalidate it. Any disagreement with the party line is assumed to arise from a corrupt impulse of the unrectified ego, and the habit of suppressing one's truth over and over creates an estrangement from one's authentic self. Our personality traits and values interact with the force field created by the polarities of truth and faith. We are drawn to this, but repelled by that. We can live with this, but can't accept that. There are a million little tugs and shoves from all directions that we absorb and integrate, and eventually we fall out at some point that becomes our place. Somewhere in the field created by the tension of these opposing values, truth and faith, we find our place, like one of the filings around the magnet. Our place is where the push toward this and the pull toward that, the sum of aversions and attractions, is the most bearable, i.e., produces the least anxiety. And we need to remember that if there is no one holding the poles, then there is no field, there is nothing to react to, there is only chaos, as with this lump of iron filings that just stays put, because there is no field to push and pull and organize them. Praise be to the holders of the poles, even when you think they've got it all wrong. And praise be to the peacemakers, the holders of paradox, the appreciators of both poles, for without them we would spiral into civil war. But through them, the warring poles cross-pollinate and produce holy fruit. In summary, to effectively manage paradox, one must give voice to each of its contradictory truths, and validate them both, at least to some degree. The canopy cannot provide its shade without people holding its poles. The pole holders, by definition, are the extremists, but they serve a function for the rest of us, and they also always hold at least a kernel of truth. When repulsed by an extreme position, identify the paradox active there, the offending view and its counter-truth, with their mission statements, action plans, upsides and downsides. Thank them both for holding their poles, and then carry on with your opposition if that's where you're holding. This alone is a giant step toward managing paradox.